We're going to take a look at reactions coming through, of course, just on the back of Brics foreign ministers in Cape Town attending a meeting to discuss both regional and global developments at this point. SABC international editor Sophie Mokoena joins us for that. Sophie, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. We just heard opening remarks now from Brics nations, the foreign ministers of the Brics countries. Perhaps we could talk to what was echoed, what's also set to the top of the agenda this time around.
I think for me, a powerful message was from the Minister of International Relations, Minister Naledi Pandor, who is a host for this Foreign Affairs Minister. I mean, she touched on the issues of just equitable world. As you are aware that there's a tendency from the North, the developed North, to suppress or to try and bully the developing South and poorer nations. She also spoke about a demand for the whole world, not few to benefit in terms of not only the few dictating. This speaks to the multipolar world rather than unipolar world. And also she spoke about the global South. This is not something new. It has been years South Africa has been pushing that all the South countries must work together and build a strong coalition or a strong bloc. And she has emphasized that. She also spoke about the governance system. You know that the multilateral organizations and also institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, the transformation thereof, including the transformation or the reforms within the Security Council, because when you look at the multilateral organizations, you will find that in the United Nations, the Security Council, the P5 are still dominating and deciding what needs to be prioritized in terms of the agenda of the Security Council, while challenges are mainly in the developing countries, particularly the African continent. And the African continent doesn't even have a single seat in the Security Council, but also the IMF and the World Bank, those loans when are being granted to African countries, when you look at the interest, they are exorbitant. And this is something that also the president of Kenya, William Ruto, spoke about when he was addressing the Pan-African Parliament. She also spoke about peace and security at a time where all eyes are in Ukraine, where there's a conflict. We know that President Ramaphosa has since announced that 6 African heads of state will be going to Moscow and also to Kyiv. But also today, this morning, in fact, it was a statement yesterday in Parliament where the president also announced that he is going to send ministers to visit the G7 countries to try and explain the South African policy, foreign policy in relation to this war in Ukraine, the non-aligned position of South Africa. And also the issue of the global currency. We know that the trading global currency is the dollar, and there are people who are saying when you impose sanctions on certain countries, it becomes a problem when the dollar is the only trading currency. And therefore the Brics member countries are going to discuss this to see whether they can't use their own currencies when they are doing business. And I think this is something that's going to happen. We saw the Development Bank, we normally call that bank Brics Bank, saying from now onwards they are going to accept currencies of Brics member countries and other countries.
Sophie, I wonder if there's any word on whether President Vladimir Putin will be coming to South Africa for the Brics summit in August. I'm asking this because the clock is ticking and, questioning whether there is enough time to get whatever needs to get done in order to ensure that that this is a well-thought-out visit. How would you respond to that?
$1 million question. The president is saying that they are still discussing this issue. The time is running out. I mean, when I spoke to the former South African president, she spoke about 2 options. Either you have this virtual, or you ask another country, a member country, to host the summit, but South Africa will continue to chair the summit. Or else you will find yourself in a situation where President Putin will come to South Africa, and there's no way you will arrest him, and by doing that you'll be breaking the law, because South Africa took a decision to domesticate the Rome Statute, and therefore you will have to comply and cooperate with the International Criminal Court. Unless President Putin decides, I'm not coming and I will join virtually, that will be a bonus, or that will be a relief to South Africa. But as we speak, it's a huge, huge, huge dilemma for the country.
South Africa is hosting the ministerial summit and amid geopolitical tensions in regard to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And I wonder, if this is obviously going to feature highly in the agenda. I'm asking this because South Africa is obviously going to have to balance ties, its historical ties with Russia, with the economic ties it has with both Europe and the US. How do we also begin to weigh in on those dynamics unfolding as we speak for South Africa?
The South African Constitution is the highest document, or the important document that South Africa has to rely on. And when you have decided to anchor your foreign policy on issues of human rights, but also issues of peace, you have to ensure that you keep to that promise. You can't deviate. And therefore, South Africa will have to explain to those who are aggrieved why they have taken certain decisions. Let's take, for example, the war in Ukraine. If you want to be an honest broker, you cannot take sides. Right now, as we speak, it might not be a big story to other people, but it is a big story if you do international news. And it looks like people are not willing to give Africa credit. The fact that Moscow has agreed that these 6 leaders must come to Moscow, meet the Russian Federation President Vladimir Putin. On the other hand, you have Ukraine, President Zelensky, Kyiv, has agreed that, come, I'm willing to meet you to talk about this issue. Here are my issues. And therefore, it speaks to being accepted by both sides. That's what mediation is all about. But others have tried, and no one is willing to listen in relation to both sides. And therefore, I think Africa, South Africa, and other countries must continue to persuade the 2 warring factions to come to the negotiating table and negotiate perhaps a way that will lead to ceasefire, because you have to stop the guns before you can engage in talks in terms of ensuring that both sides are not aggrieved. And I think that the issue of the war in Ukraine, this is an opportunity for Minister Naledi Pandor to persuade her counterparts to say, support this African mission. You also have other foreign affairs ministers from other powerful countries, like Saudi Arabia. So you have a moment, an opportunity to lobby the world. We had yesterday the ambassador of the US at the UN speaking to Shaw and Bryce Peace that they are watching this meeting and they have made their own inputs. And therefore, Minister Pandor, on behalf of South Africa, on behalf of Africa, can consolidate the inputs. And I expect after the meeting tomorrow, the issue of the war in Ukraine will be part of the resolutions.
Sophie, there were other extended invitations granted to other foreign ministers from Africa as well as other countries. And I wonder whether this sends out a strong sign, or if this is a strong sign of the growing interest for the global South to join in on Brics. How would you weigh in on that?
Well, there's hunger for other countries to join Brics. I spoke about Saudi Arabia, Argentina, Venezuela, and others. Iran is there. But on the continent, it has been a tradition for South Africa. When South Africa is hosting a big conference, international conference, to invite other leaders on the continent, because it has been South Africa's position that you can't have a prosperous South Africa without a prosperous continent. You can't have a peaceful South Africa without a peaceful continent. And therefore, South Africa always strive to ensure that the whole continent is supporting whatever decision the country is taking at the multilateral level, and also in terms of the global financial institutions, because it has been a tradition. The renaissance of Africa is all about countries working together. And South Africa, a developed country, a country that is more industrialized, the second largest economy, has to live by example. And therefore, they always invite leaders. Even the summit Heads of State Summit coming, the leaders of the continent have been invited.
Lots of bilateral meetings also set to take place as the meeting or the summit gets underway. Let's leave that conversation there for now. Thank you for joining us, SABC News International Editor Sophie Mokoena, weighing in on the opening remarks, of course, that just occurred a few moments ago by Brics foreign ministers who are in attendance at the meeting in Cape Town. Developing story we will continue to monitor. Lots of expectations. We'll wait to see what the outcomes are and perhaps how this influences the regional and global developments, solutions to that need to occur. Again, thank you to her for her time.